Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by PYA. Today, we're continuing our timely, tough, or tricky physician compensation and fair market value topics series with a presentation on compensation for physicians working collaboratively with APPs. PYA is happy to present today's webinar on this important topic. You'll have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters by typing a message into the questions pane of the control panel. We'll collect these and address them via email after the webinar, and all our webinars are recorded and released with a copy of the slides after the event. With that, I'd like to introduce today's moderators, Lyle Oelrich and Angie Caldwell, principals at PYA.
Thank you, Shannon. And again, a warm welcome to all of our participants today, and welcome back as well to many of you who regularly participate in the Timely, Tough, or Tricky, or as we like to call it, the TTT series on hot topics in physician compensation and fair market value in 2023. My name is Lyle Oelrich, and today we are really excited to cover the number one topic in a poll that we took at the beginning of this year, that of physician compensation issues that arise when physicians and advanced practice practitioners, or APPs, work together. And of course, by APPs, we mean nurse practitioners, physician's assistants, midwives, and many others, just to name a few. But before we jump in real quickly, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, of course, the discussion today will focus on general education topics only. So what we talk about here is not intended to represent an opinion, which would be based off of a specific set of facts and circumstances. And of course, we were always happy to talk with you about your specific situation, so please don't hesitate to reach out to one of us. Second, and finally, we'd like to ask for your participation during our discussion today by answering a couple of quick multiple choice questions. Don't worry, no one will have to jump off mute to answer those questions. They're just going to be some simple multiple choice questions that will pop up on your screen to answer, and more on that here in just a couple of moments. So to talk with me about this subject today, I'm super pleased to welcome back my partner, Angie Caldwell. Angie is the managing partner of our Tampa office and also a principal in our compensation valuation planning and design department. And while I know she won't admit it, Angie's got several decades of experience where she helps physicians and hospitals with issues such as compensation valuation, commercial reasonableness, and physician compensation design. As for myself, very briefly, I too am a principal in PYA's CVPD department, as we call it for short. Like Angie, I focus on compensation valuation, commercial reasonableness, and a host of other financial, strategic, and operational issues facing physicians and hospitals. As I mentioned a few moments ago, we're here to talk about the number one survey topic to a poll that was taken in January of this year. As you can see, for that poll, we asked 50 physician compensation experts about the physician compensation and fair market value topics they are currently facing, and physician compensation while working collaboratively with APPs was number one on the list. So today we're going to dive into that area with an emphasis on the 4 ways that APPs practice with physicians, then physician compensation models where they work collaboratively with APPs, and then offer some final thoughts on the proposed 2024 Medicare Physician Fee Schedule regarding split shared billings. But before we move on, just a couple of other comments here on this particular slide. First, for those of you all that see this list and may want to visit some of these, we have spoken about some of them. We're not all the way through the Triple T series yet, but we have talked about the end of the public health emergency, number 2 on the list. We've talked about the 2023 Medicare Physician Fee Schedule, unique call coverage scenarios, and the last one on this list, anesthesia and other hospital-based specialty arrangements. So if you want to revisit any of these webinars, again, they're all 30 minutes. You can listen to them at your convenience. I'll ask the moderator to chat in a link so that you have that for your ease of reference. Also, very briefly, there is a 2022 survey that we took as well. This is the second season of the Triple T webinar series. So that will be in the link as well, to the extent that anybody wants to revisit that particular topic. So with that being said, let's talk about the 4 ways to kind of set the ground here, or the foundation for our discussion, that APPs can work and collaboratively with physicians. And as we do, I'd like for you to pay particular attention to who is rendering the service and who is billing for the service. And that's where the rubber sort of begins to meet the road, using an old cliche here, when thinking about physician productivity and corresponding productivity credit for items like physician work RVUs. And again, more on that here in just a moment, but let's go through these 4. So first, we have services that are independently provided by APPs. So this is where an APP provides the service within their scope of practice without any direct physician involvement. And so when we talk about CMS, for example, these claims are going to be billed under the APP's National Provider Identifier, or MPI, and are usually billed at 85% of the Medicare Physician Fee Schedule. So in this case, these services are billed by and rendered by the APP. Next, we have Incident 2 services. As you are likely aware, Medicare allows physicians to bill for non-facility services, such as those that are rendered in a physician practice or medical office building, rendered by another individual, and in this case, the APP, to an established patient that are incidental to a physician's treatment plan. So in this case, the services may be rendered by an APP, but billed by the physician. Third, we have split shared services. This refers to an evaluation and management service that is jointly performed by a physician and an APP in the hospital or facility setting, such as an emergency department. Currently, the provider who performs the substantive portion of the E&M encounter, or more than half of the total time, receives the billing credit, whereas some or a portion of the encounter could have been performed by another provider. And that substantive portion could be more than, under the current regulations, 50% of the time. The proposal is to go exclusively to 50% of the time, and Angie will talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. And finally, we have globally surgical billed services. This refers to services rendered, of course, before, during, or after a surgical procedure. And at times, APPs can perform one or more of these items, such as the post-surgical visit. If that occurs, the service, or in this case, a part of the service, in the example I just cited about the post-surgical follow-up, would be rendered by the APP, but billed under the physician's NPI number. So let's talk a little bit then about the impact of APPs on physician compensation. And I teed this up just a couple of moments ago, but why, might you ask, are we spending so much time on clarifying the models where APPs and physicians work collaboratively? And we're not attorneys here, but as you're likely aware, the Stark Law prohibits referrals to entities with which physicians have a financial relationship when designated health services are involved. However, many of the Stark Law exceptions are predicated on services being personally performed by the physician. And so in this case, and in fact, I want to draw your attention to one quote from CMS and some commentary that they've made on this particular issue. So, and I quote, "Concerns arise when payments for items or services provided as the result of the physician's referrals or the business physicians generate, rather than the physician's own labor is included in the calculation of compensation. So this concept of personally performed then really becomes important, and that's where we get into all these collaborative physician APP models and who provides the service versus who is given credit for it when it is billed. So then each of the four ways here that APPs work with physicians could impact compliance with the Stark regulations surrounding physician compensation. Now, of course, the cleanest way for APPs not to impact physician compensation is to have them bill under their own MPI number, this independent scenario that we're talking about here. And so again, in that case, there's really no impact to physician compensation. But if you're billing incident to, split shared, or globally, you run the chance that services performed by APPs could be attributed to physicians. And then when an organization goes to compensate a physician, in part, they are doing so for the APP's productivity. So one way to remedy this situation, and I'm teeing this up for Angie because she's going to get into a number of different ways that you could remedy this situation potentially. And this example is at least for incident to services, but perhaps others, is to make sure that when you are calculating productivity statistics that then you use to pay physicians, you make sure that those statistics are using rendered by versus billed by data. And that can really be helpful in this particular instance. So with that being said, I think it's time for our first poll. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Angie.
Sounds great. Moderator, would you release our poll? So everyone, if you will answer on the poll on your screen, how often does your organization evaluate the impact of APPs on physician productivity? Never, every year, or at the end of each agreement cycle, for example, every 3 to 5 years. You'll have a few seconds to answer the poll. And this is just for us to gauge what our audience is doing and thinking out there. And it's, since we're not providing CPE credit today, we're not monitoring the answers or your participation. It's really just to inform us as well as the other audience members today. Looks like we have pretty good number of responses coming through. Moderator, if you'll go ahead and release the results, please. So the results are here in front of you, and it looks like that organizations are looking at the impact of APPs on productivity every year, which is terrific. Lyle, I don't know if you have any comments about the results of the poll, but this is good news.
Yeah, Angie, I would definitely agree. Certainly from a compliance perspective, every year I think is the better performing practice. I think we do have a number of organizations who are just beginning to sort of understand how APPs and physicians work collaboratively and what that means for compliance related to physician compensation models. So, if we were to take this this survey again this time next year, I imagine we'll see more in the every year, and then at the end of each agreement cycle. We've certainly had many clients who are working on their infrastructure to be able to do this more properly, so they choose to do it at a certain periodic frequency, and it may be every 3 years, every 5 years. But I bet this will change pretty significantly over the next year. So, Angie, back to you.
Sounds good. Yes, it's an issue that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And to your point, that some folks are just now really thinking about the issue and how to work through it from a physician compensation perspective. So we're going to share 3 possible solutions for you today. We don't pretend that these are the only solutions, but they are 3 solid options for your organizations to consider. And in a moment, I'm going to walk through the math of this, and I know that there are probably some people in the audience that want to see the math. Others, you'll just have to kind of hold your nose as we as we go through the math part of this. But let's explain the three different options. So the APP reduction option is essentially taking the net cost of the APP and offsetting it against compensation that is derived for the physician by multiplying a conversion factor times 100% of the physician's work RVUs. So that way, then the net cost of the APP is absorbed by the physician. This is most like a private practice scenario, and we'll talk through that a little bit more in a moment, but it is a good option for you. Second option that you may want to consider is what we call physician work RVU reduction. And in this scenario, we're actually bifurcating the work RVUs between those personally performed by the physician and those where there is physician APP collaboration, and compensating a different rate based upon the work RVU type. And so this, of course, requires an estimate as it relates to determining the number of work RVUs that are APP collaborative. In the last scenario, the last option that you might consider, we call it physician work RVU reduction with or without a stipend. And so what this means is that you are compensating the physician for a reduced number of work RVUs. So you are looking at across the physician's work RVU population. You are literally going in and adjusting those down for work RVUs related to APP collaboration and then compensating accordingly. So with that, let's show the math. Let's show the work a little bit, if you will, on each of these options. So on the screen in front of you is an example of the math related to APP reduction. Again, this is most like a private practice. So I'm going to point out on rows D through G, and actually H as well. So rows D through H, these are items known to you as an organization. So this is reliant upon data that you should have within your systems. Perhaps row G, there might be a little bit of an estimate related to allocated overhead, but the other items are known inputs into this particular formula. So you can see how this works out. The difficulty with this methodology is when you have one or multiple physicians sharing one APP. So you have an APP that's serving or working with collaborating with one or more physicians. So then you get into an estimate of how do you allocate or reduce or estimate rows D through H related to that sharing of the APP. So that is one difficulty with this example, with this method, that we wanted to point out for your consideration, although it would work very well if there is a one-to-one matching between physician and APP. So the second option, recall, it's called physician work RVU reduction, where we're literally bifurcating the work RVUs between those that are personally performed and those that are performed in collaboration with an APP, and paying different compensation per work RVU rates. So you can see the math on this screen, where in this instance, the estimate comes into number one, how do you determine the row B, how do you determine the estimate for that compensation per work RVU adjustment, number one, and then row E, formula row E, there's another adjustment that needs to be made because you need to be able to estimate how many of the work RVUs that have been attributed to the physician were done in collaboration with the APP. I want to point out, because you might be wondering and might wish that you could flip back to the slide before to see how this compares from a physician compensation perspective between method 1 and method 2. Method 1 produced a physician compensation of about $838,750. So you can see methodology 2 at $837,225 is very close. option 3, which is we call it the physician work RVU reduction, where we're the total physician work RVUs and reducing them by an amount to arrive at the physician's personally performed work RVU productivity. So the challenge with this methodology, of course, is coming into, again, trying to estimate, trying to determine how many of the work RVUs attributed to the physician are actually personally performed. We've used 10% in this estimate. It is an estimate that Lyle and I and others at PYA see often as it relates to collaborative physician APP collaborative arrangements. It's one estimate, it's not every estimate, and of course that estimate will be determined based upon the specific facts and circumstances of your organization and how highly leveraged that APP is and how they work with that physician. So you can see here how the math works down on the screen in front of you. And I do want to compare row G on the screen that this methodology, physician compensation, is 833,500. Remember the prior two, and if you don't, I have those numbers for you. But methodology 1 produced 838,750, and methodology 2 produced 837,225. We do not believe that that is coincidental. We believe that because it is evidence that the three methodologies using similar inputs but different math and different approaches is that it lends some evidence that these three methodologies would be good methodologies for consideration for your organizations. So they aren't without difficulty. Again, there are estimates involved in each of these, and we understand that making those estimates would require time studies, perhaps coding and billing studies, perhaps shadowing of physicians and some other things. And that might be another topic for a discussion on a different day. So with that, we're going to move to our second poll question. Moderator, if you'll release the poll. How do you pay your physicians for APP supervision? Is it part of their salary? Is it an annual stipend? Is it through the attribution of APP production? Or do you pay them another way? If you will respond, just click on your screen related to the answer that you want to provide to us today. We thank you for participating in the poll. It informs the other audience members as well as Lyle and I as we're thinking through these topics with you today. I'm going to give just another few seconds as the poll comes through, and I think you're going to really we're really going to appreciate the results of the poll today. Moderator, if you'll release the poll, please. So it's nearly evenly split. So between the APP supervision being part of salary, part of an annual stipend, or attribution of APP production, I would be interested to see what the other option is related to this poll. That might be just a catch-all for folks that aren't sure of how to answer this question. But if you do have a particular methodology that you would like for us to know about, please put it in the chat. We'd happy to learn more about that. Lyle, do you have any thoughts on the poll?
Yeah, just for perspective and the audience's just consideration, I think most frequently, at least I see the stipend sort of being the most frequent way that this is done. And then after that, the part of the salary is the second most frequent. And then for the reasons that we're talking about today, the attribution of APP production and sort of the double dip concept that could occur here, we're seeing fewer of those. So to me, this poll is really interesting. And I know we had over 200 people sign up for the webinar today. Just in the event people are just curious about total numbers, I'm sure not all of those made it today, but just for a little bit of sample size consideration as well.
Thanks, Lyle. Moderator, if you'll go ahead and take us away to the next slide, that would be great. So then transitioning from those options into a comment that, and from Lyle's introductory part here, really thinking through what happens or what is going to happen with respect to the time-based split shared billing a matter that was mentioned earlier. So first of all, we can all take a big collective sigh of relief because about 2 weeks ago, CMS delayed the time requirement for split shared billing until December 31, 2024. So just 2 weeks ago, we were sitting here knowing that we had about 5 more months to figure it out. Thankfully, we all have a little bit more time to figure out how to deal with this. And then, of course, this ties back to some of the key comments as well regarding split shared billing, since that most often appears in your system as being billed and rendered by the same person, even though we know that that is a, by its definition, a collaborative service. So just to level set on this issue, and we know that you've heard about this multiple times, but in 2023 and 2024, clinicians will continue to have their choice of history, exam, or medical decision making, or more than half of the total time spent to define the substantive portion of the E&M visit. That is what determines who gets quote unquote credit for the split shared service. So when, for example, if the person doing the medical decision making gets credit for the service, they are going to show up in the system as being both the billed and the rendering provider. Starting in 2025, January 1, 2025, the provider who renders more than 50% of the time will be shown in your system as the billing and rendering provider. So this is important on several fronts. Number one, this rule did not remove our issue that we introduced in the beginning of this discussion today. It just changed who might be showing up in your system as the person getting credit for the service. So we want to have a call to action as it relates to this, and thankfully this call to action has a longer tail now than it did just a couple of weeks ago. But there are 3 main things that we are asking our audience and others to be thinking about. First of all, the changes in attribution of work RVUs between the providers, it's coming. And so now is the time to prepare for it. And it's not just a billing change, it's not just a time tracking change, but it's also going to impact provider compensation as compared to historical levels. What was once attributed to a physician may now be attributed to an APP, or vice versa. I don't want to ignore the fact that some APPs providing split shared services are also paid or compensated on a work RVU basis. So now's the time to begin thinking through that, and then how that is going to impact the compensation levels of the providers due to this change. Second, the continued modification of the underlying work RVU values may compound this issue. So we have modifying amounts related to the various E&M codes that are going in, and as they are an input to the physician compensation formula, and that could in and of itself compound this issue, as well as changes to the CMS conversion factor itself. So, you know, we always look at not only the productivity of the provider as it relates to, you know, analyzing compensation, but we're also looking at professional collections. So that could impact it as well. And then lastly, but not leastly, current benchmark data will take a while to catch up on this issue. And that will be impacted by how quickly organizations are changing their compensation plans for this issue. if they are deciding to change their compensation plans altogether, and how they are handling it. So once we roll into future years, we'll just need to be aware of this significant change and its potential impact on the benchmark survey data. So we want to thank you for your attendance today. These webinars are intended to be a quick bit of information for you, a quick bit of information on some very timely, tough, and tricky topics. But we want to thank you for attending today. Please feel free to send us your questions. Our contact information appeared at the beginning of the presentation and is also in your materials. Lyle, do you have any closing comments for our audience today?
That's it, Angie. Just appreciate everybody's participation. These are some really important items. They may get changed in priority on your to-do list, but they are very, very important.
Thank you very much. We'll turn it over to Shannon to wrap us up.
Angie, Lyle, thank you very much for that presentation. Like Angie said, if you have any questions, this presentation and their contact information will be emailed to you along with a recording of today's webinar. Also, if PYA can provide assistance with audit, tax, compliance, valuation, or physician services, call or email us. You can also visit our website, pyapc.com, for more details about our specific areas of expertise or to subscribe to receive PYA insights. On behalf of PYA, thanks so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.